I'm Dr. Tasia White, and you're listening to Things My Boss Never Told Me. Hello, and welcome to Things My Boss Never Told Me. I am your gracious host, Dr. Tasia White, and it feels so good to be back. I did not anticipate taking such a long hiatus, but it was certainly necessary for me personally. And one of the things that I've been up to the last few months is I started a part-time job. And it sort of started as just something seasonal, but I decided to continue and the opportunity presented itself. I'm working in an HR type position, and it's been a lot of fun. Sort of felt like the last few months have been sort of a case study for me because of the observing that I've been doing with the various people that I work with and interact with, and much of what I have observed has either been supporting the things that I've already talked about or providing me with a different perspective that I will be sharing with you as we go along. So today's topic is the do's and don'ts of change leadership. And if you recall from episode number 10, at the end of the episode, I mentioned that I would be talking about change leadership, but I wasn't entirely sure the direction I wanted to go in. And after having lots of time to sort of peruse through different thoughts and ideas and books that I had, I decided to focus on the do's and don'ts of change leadership. The things that I feel are helpful when it comes to change leadership, and the things that are maybe not so helpful as it relates to change leadership. And so you may be wondering, what is change leadership? So how I view it is leading some kind of large scale change within an organization or even within a department. Changes could be structural, operational, or functional. And so it could be a situation where there's some restructuring taking place amongst personnel, or restructuring of positions, or a complete takeover from a department or from another organization. So if you can remember back in episodes number 7 and 8, I talked about personnel changes and how we as leaders have certain things that we should do as it relates to changes taking place within our teams. So whether team members are changing out or if we are stepping into a role where we are adopting a new team, there are certain things that would be helpful for us to set things up. And so that's where I talked about the 6 key components to having effective teams, right? And so that was the premise of episodes 7 and 8. In this episode, I'm specifically talking about a large scale change that's going to impact not just a department, but multiple departments or an entire division or an entire organization, depending on what the changes are. And the goal that I feel is most important as it relates to change leadership is having very minimal disruption, because the more disruption that we have, the more it impacts the people and their ability to do their job and do their job well. So let's be realistic. There will be some kind of disruption. Why? Because no one likes change. However, disruption is unavoidable. And if we can do these little things that I have recommended here, I feel that it would make the change leadership process go much smoother, and you as a leader can come out on the other side feeling like your team is on board with you as these changes are happening. And that will be the premise of this episode, talking about the do's and don'ts of change leadership, the things that would be helpful and the things that maybe we should try to avoid as it relates to change leadership. And so part of what I'm sharing is stuff that I've personally experienced, as well as things that I've seen. And change leadership is a very big deal, but I feel like it's something that we don't really talk about enough, especially when changes are taking place at a rapid pace. And given where we are post the pandemic, I feel like even more changes are going to be taking place. And so the easier it can be for our employees, the better it will be for us as leaders, right? Okay, so with that said, let's go ahead and start with what you should not do when it comes to implementing change. So the first recommendation that comes to mind is implementing change haphazardly. Now, I feel like we should know that this is a bad idea, right? We shouldn't come to our teams with a plan that's half-baked, telling them this is happening right now or this is happening within a week when all of the details haven't exactly been figured out. And granted, there may be some flexibility, there may be some changes. My recommendation would be to maybe have a plan that's 80% complete, and that 20% could be your wiggle room in making that known that there is this component that hasn't exactly been figured out, but we're waiting to sort of see how things pan out before we complete that last 20%. When you have a haphazard plan, it creates confusion, it can certainly increase the disruption, and it creates a lack of organization. Even if you don't have all of the pieces figured out, you can still implement things on a rolling basis or in phases, and making that known to your employees so that they understand that this is not the end all be all. This is phase 1, this is the plan for phase 1, this is phase 2, here's our plan for phase 2, etc. But to go in there with half a plan is just setting ourselves up for failure. So do not implement plans haphazardly. Number 2, it's really important to not be secretive or misleading about the changes being made. And the reason for that is, and I've talked about this in previous episodes, trust is so important. Having your employees trust you can go a long way, because who wants to be in a position where these changes need to take place and your team is not in support of it? That is not a great position to be in. I should know, I've sort of been in that position before. And so if you're secretive or misleading in any way, that creates a disruption, because then they can't trust you and therefore they are not able to focus on the task at hand. Any breakdown in trust can lead to more secrets and make others more suspicious. And when people are suspicious, they tend to think the worst, right? And so they may think that one thing is happening and that may not be the case at all. And so it's really important for us as leaders to make sure that we are being transparent and share the good, the bad, and the ugly. At the end of the day, your teams just want to be in the loop. They want to know what's happening. And if there are personnel changes, obviously they're going to be concerned if people are being put into different roles or people are being asked to leave. It's important to try to find a way to share that information without creating mass panic. And obviously there are some things that need to be taken into account if terminations are taking place. Do everything that you can to minimize any breakdown in trust, because again, the goal is minimal disruption, right? Now, an example that comes to mind for me is when one of the organizations that I worked for made several terminations in a very short period of time. And people were freaking out about it. Like, they were concerned about their own well-being and their own jobs because it was so out of the blue, and it was something that none of us had any idea was even a possibility. It was just one day several people were let go and that was it. And so not only was this sense of fear starting to settle in for individuals, you also had people on the other end of the spectrum who were very upset and made their opinions very known. And the leadership, unfortunately, received some very nasty, yet professional, in some cases, not all, but some very nasty comments and feedback that probably could have been avoided had the terminations been more well known. Not exactly who was being terminated or when they were being terminated, but at least notifying the community that, hey, this is something that is coming through the pipeline and we want to get you prepared for it. Or, we're not doing so well in these areas and therefore we're going to be making some changes. In our case, these people were let go, and with it being such a small community, it had a really significant impact on the morale. I feel like the aftermath of that could have been, again, minimized, not avoided, but it could have been minimized with a little bit more transparency. And so, if nothing else, remember that transparency can be your friend when it comes to change leadership. Point number 3, try not to be distant or unreachable. If you want to decrease trust, make yourself unavailable. Close your door. Hide from the people who have the questions. But if you want to increase trust and be engaging, that will certainly help you. And if anything, the more visible that you are, the more it builds your credibility. And unfortunately, when we are in these leadership roles, we have to make unpopular decisions, right? And so when that happens, we can't make those decisions and then hide from the people who are being impacted by that. We have to have accountability for ourselves and stand firm in our decision to do this thing, as opposed to communicating the decision and then hiding. Because more than anything, it's going to make people angry. Like, it's going to piss them off that they're not able to ask questions or to get some additional insight or just be able to express themselves. In previous episodes, I talked about fair process. And while we want to be very careful about creating spaces for employees to share their concerns, we also need to make sure that we are at least giving them that outlet so that they're not gossiping amongst themselves or finding other outlets or literally leaving the organization. Having some individual and maybe some small group check-ins versus doing some kind of big forum, because it will allow them to do that venting in a respectful way. I've seen both examples, and I've found that the small group and individual check-ins tend to go a little bit better. It just yields a positive outcome. Number 4, try not to be abrupt with these changes. Why? For the reasons I've already shared. It puts people on edge. It decreases trust. It may be a situation where the people that are doing well, they're like, look, I'm jumping ship before things get crazy. And when we create that sense of instability, their fight, flight, or freeze mechanisms start to kick in. And so when those senses kick in, you don't know what kind of response you may get from someone. Number 5, the things that you should not do is use fear as a mechanism or a tactic. Fear just drives more fear or anger. It does not increase productivity. It does not make one want to continue to go to work. If anything, if you think back to what I shared in previous episodes with Maslow's hierarchy of needs, security and stability are at the bottom of the pyramid, right? And that's the part that keeps us stable as we try to establish a foundation within the organization. When fear is used as a tactic, it creates cracks in the sense of security and the stability that will eventually crumble, and those individuals may want to take other types of actions that are not helpful for the cause, that's not helpful for the changes that need to take place. And so at the end of the day, fear is not a sustainable tactic. You can't rely on that, because eventually fear will drive people out. And if that is your goal, then great. But if you have good quality people that you want to keep, using fear to keep them is not going to work in the long run. And so again, this is something that I noticed in my own observations as it related to change leadership. In the example I shared previously, where it was a surprise and people were upset about it, and not that fear was purposefully used, but I felt like at one point there was sort of this underlining message that if you didn't like or agree with the changes, then you could go too. Like, that was the feeling that was sort of lingering around after those changes were made so abruptly. And quality people started to look elsewhere. They started to leave and try to find other opportunities. And I feel like that was not the overall objective, right? And so being mindful of what underlining feelings that may be projected as it relates to these changes is really, really important. You want people to be excited about the change. You want people to feel invigorated by it. You want people to feel engaged, and they can't do so if they're fearful of what may come. So let's just quickly recap the 5 things that you should not do as it relates to change leadership. So first is implementing a plan that is done haphazardly or doesn't have at least 80% of the details figured out. 2, being secretive or misleading about the changes being made and why they're being made. 3, to be distant or unreachable when these changes are taking place. 4, being abrupt or surprising others with changes suddenly. And then 5, use fear as a tactic for moving the needle along. So now let's transition to the things that we should be doing, the things that would be helpful as it relates to change leadership. Okay, so first we have be intentional every step of the way. Try to consider the communication and overall messaging that will be going out. Think about the tone being set, where or whom the messages are coming from, and when these messages are going out. That all relates to what I was saying before about being timely in terms of sharing information, not doing so abruptly, or doing so in a way that puts people on edge, and making sure that the messages are being consistent. I would say communication is probably the number one thing that will help to ease the transition. Being intentional in that way. Also being intentional about the specific changes being made and whether or not those changes are sustainable. Consider the long-term impact on the teams, the individuals, the organization as a whole, and really try to make sure that these changes are necessary and that they will improve the overall operation of the organization or improve the organization in some way. And it's not just something that's being done because it's trendy or something that your competitor is doing. Being mindful about the long-term impact. And obviously that will be crucial as it relates to the planning that takes place and whether or not things take place in phases. So intentionality is key. Okay, number 2, share the plan and vision in advance. Let your employees know what are the specific changes that are taking place, why these changes are taking place, when these changes are taking place, who these changes are going to impact the most, and how will they be impacted as a result. Filling in all of the details for them so that it can help to put them at ease. Most of the time, there is a concern about the unknown. And so if you fill in those gaps about what is unknown, then it makes it a little bit more tolerable. And once you've shared those details, giving your teams an opportunity to grapple with it, allow them some time to sort of process it, because not everyone's going to be on board right away. Even if it's something good, there may still be some resistance. And so you have to give people just a little bit of time to sort of process the change. And that's where those check-ins would be helpful with small groups and individuals, because then they'll be able to share with you any thoughts or concerns that they may have related to the changes. And here's where fair process can be helpful, because then you're hearing them out. And even if you decide not to take their advice, it's still providing them an outlet to share those concerns. And as you're sharing the plan and vision, try to create some excitement and anticipation around the changes. Uncertainty is the part that is really impacting people the most. And so if you as the leader show some excitement and some anticipation around what the changes are, then they too may feel excited about these changes because they're sort of feeding off of your energy versus telling them these changes are being made. It is what it is. Like, that's not going to yield a very good outcome. Okay, number 3, take your time with rolling out the plan. As I mentioned previously, do so in phases. I feel like a phase model can really go a long way, especially if there are time frames that people can prepare for. I have seen that model positively impact the culture as the changes were being made. And so consider that when it comes to the actual implementation process, just sort of rolling it out so that there isn't this pressure to get everything done as soon as possible, because you're going to need people to do the work that they were already doing and learn the new work that they'll be doing, and then start to do the new work going forward. And so that's not something that can just be done overnight. And so using some kind of phase model will definitely help. And in that process, new ideas may emerge. You may have people who come forth and say, hey, I have a more effective way of doing this, or hey, I think this way may work a little bit better than that way. And so before, when I was talking about having 80% of the plan done, this is where the 20% get filled in while you're rolling things out, while people are sharing their thoughts and ideas, and you're generating excitement around it. So if you're in a situation where time is limited, then one thing that I would encourage you to ask is this change really sustainable? Like, if you're really feeling the need to make this change right now and you don't have all of the pieces figured out, is this change necessary? Number 4, consider the impact on all levels. So there's one model in particular that I think is really helpful as it relates to change leadership, and it comes from the book Adaptive Leadership. And in the book, the authors talk about the dance floor and balcony model. And so what they mean by that is you have the dance floor that represents the operations and just how things function on a day-to-day. And then we have the balcony, which represents the broader perspective, like the long-term vision, strategic planning, and the overall operation of the organization. And so the balcony level, the leadership sort of looking downward, if they're only looking at it from the balcony view, then they're only going to get one perspective about how things are supposed to go or how things are. And so it can be very limited in terms of understanding just how things are in a day-to-day. Versus when you're on the dance floor and you are part of that day-to-day, you have a very different perspective on what will work, what will not work, how feasible certain things will be. One of the things that the authors recommended in this book, which I will include a link to on my website, but one of the things that they recommended in this book is that when it comes to change, you should be operating from both the dance floor and the balcony. So understanding what the large scale changes that need to take place to sort of keep the machine moving, but then also looking at things on a micro level to see what is actually feasible. And so the only way for us to truly do this is to look at things from the micro level and the macro level and sort of try to fill in the pieces in between to understand how to go about making changes in a way that is helpful to the company, but not overly disruptive to those within the company. There are many ways to do some form of this, right? You may need to have individuals on various levels from various teams sharing their perspective. So not solely working with the leaders of the departments being impacted, or not solely working with the entry level or mid-level employees within those departments or within the organization. Really trying to get a diverse perspective by having people at various levels contributing to the conversation. And so not just those that may feel relevant because of their title or because of their position, but those who know the minute details as it relates to the overall function of the organization. Last, certainly not least, something else that I would recommend is designating ambassadors. Having ambassadors is really great for filtering information. And so these can be people who already have interpersonal credibility, or individuals who are already in similar roles where they disperse information. And so they can be the ones to help disperse the information in a way that is helpful for the masses to understand. They can also help with building buy-in, getting others on board with this new change that's taking place. And then they could also act as the gatherers of information that could be shared with the leadership, so that leadership isn't overwhelmed by the questions and the comments that the employees may have. Earlier, I mentioned being approachable. While that is important for the leaders to be in the front of it, it doesn't mean that the leader has to be the sole person sharing the information. You can have these designated individuals who can be the messengers, but making sure that they have the most accurate information and making sure that these individuals are well liked and respected is crucial. And this is something that I saw that I thought was pretty cool, because they were strategic about the individuals that they chose to be ambassadors, and those ambassadors were provided information and instructed to disseminate the information to everyone else. And I feel that helped with implementing the actual change, because of the people that they chose to be ambassadors. They were individuals that were approachable, and so employees trusted them and trusted that they were receiving the correct information or receiving accurate information in the way that was easy for them to understand. And the deadlines that were set for implementing this change was met at a much more reasonable pace because there were a plethora of individuals across various departments who were sharing the information with their teams, with employees. It also provided employees a person to maybe ask questions who maybe didn't feel comfortable going to their supervisor or, who really just wanted to know what was really happening. And so I highly, highly recommend having some designated ambassadors who can help to build that morale and get people on board with the changes. Now, let's say you're in a situation where you don't necessarily agree with the changes that are taking place. Well, here are a few options for you. One, you can find a way to make peace with it, or you can choose to leave. It's cut and dry, but that's really what it is. Because if you are in a leadership position and you are expected to carry out this change, then that's your role. And so you have to decide whether or not this is something that you want to do, whether or not you are fully on board with it, and decide to proceed accordingly. Be careful yet respectful about the stance that you may have. And so I'm someone who has no problem speaking out about how I feel, but I am mindful about whom I share that with, which typically would be with a supervisor, and it would typically be behind closed doors or in an email directly to them, and not a situation where I'm bringing it up with the masses, because that's not going to help my argument overall, right? Next, and this certainly connects to what I just said, try to avoid any venting or demonstrating any negative attitudes you may have about the change, because that is going to trickle down to the people that you supervise. And so if you're not excited about it, they're not going to be excited. If you're resistant to it, they're going to be resistant to it. And so going back to what I was saying previously, you really got to try to make peace with the changes being made, because however you feel about it is going to be the impression that your teams may have about it. And sometimes we can be biased and we just don't necessarily see it that way, and that's okay. But if we're being charged with implementing this change, then we need to be sure to have an open mind and try to be as neutral as possible. And then last, just making sure that we are being consistent and we are leading by example. And so being consistent with the messages that are being shared, being consistent about how we feel about it, even if there's maybe some small scale things that maybe don't agree with, and being consistent about that, right? And that's where the transparency may be helpful. And so it is really important for us to make sure that we are being consistent and that we are demonstrating the right attitudes that are necessary for the change to be implemented. And so overall, as I mentioned when I started this episode, change is inevitable, but how we go about rolling out and implementing the change can make a significant difference. And no matter what we do, there is always going to be some kind of disruption, because many people, most people, have an aversion to change. But it's important for us to make sure that we are setting the right intentions and actions in motion so that we can try to minimize that disruption as much as possible. And so yes, people may not like it and they may resist it, but the more that you try to minimize the disruption, the more that they will be respectful of the change and do what is necessary to make it happen, okay? That is my advice to you as it relates to change leadership. I hope that it was helpful, and it would be nice to think that, maybe this will never have to happen, but in the real world, it does happen. And I've gone through many iterations of large-scale change to know that it's going to happen in some way or another. And so the best thing we can do is prepare ourselves before we are sort of thrown into uncharted territory. Okay, so with that said, let's go ahead and start this week's gratitude list. First, I am grateful for the experiences I've had, good and bad, that have changed my change leadership perspective. Without any of those experiences, I probably would not have been able to speak to this topic. Like, yes, I've read books on how it should work, but books can only take you but so far, right? And so taking the knowledge that I've gotten from those books and comparing that to what I've seen and experienced has certainly enabled me to share this knowledge with you. And so I'm very, very grateful for the good and the bad, because it provided me with a very broad perspective. So next, I'm grateful for my doctoral program's curriculum because of how much it promoted sustainable change. sustainable change is so important. Like, we want to make sure that the changes that we are making make sense. And it's not just some fad or something that other organizations are doing just because they can have such a significant impact on us and long-term impact on us. And so no matter what, we should always be operating from the standpoint of change being sustainable. Is this something that's going to hold up? Is this something that's going to be helpful for me for the next 3 to 5 years? And if the answer is no, then why is this happening? Why even go through this process of uprooting people and putting ourselves in uncomfortable positions by creating this disruption, right? So thank you, Drexel. Last but not least, I am grateful for the patience and support of my teams who endured the change leadership process with me. And so there were cases where I wasn't exactly sure what was happening, and I just had to keep going and being supportive and being a listening ear. And it was frustrating for all of us, but we made it through. And there have also been times where I was excited and they were excited and the process went very smoothly, and it's all a learning process, right? And so I'm very, very grateful for my team members because they have certainly been instrumental in making the process go and for making the changes happen. There were some great moments and some not so great moments, and that's okay because at the end of the day, we made it through. And so I'm really, really grateful for how instrumental my teams were in that process, making it just a little bit easier for me. All right, now we will close out with this episode's affirmation. And so it is, I possess the qualities and skills of an effective change leader. That is how I want you to feel at the end of this episode, that you are much more equipped to handle large-scale changes that need to take place and the foundational pieces to help you in that process. Obviously, it's going to be specific to each person based on their organization and their role, but hopefully these do's and don'ts gave you some insight on what you can anticipate and how to possibly avoid it, okay? Now, in our next episode, we will talk about what the advantages are of doing things like listening to a podcast on leadership and explore why it is important for us to participate in professional development as we continue on our leadership journey. And so with that said, thank you so much for listening and have a great day. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Things My Boss Never Told Me. Before you go, please make sure that you like and subscribe down below. Also, I included a few recommended videos for you to check out. Thank me later.